this is the very interesting segue that of course your grand vision with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which of course you have continued to this day very successfully, but the beast from the east comes in 2017, and of course you're forced to adapt. What did we call it in COVID? Pivot. You had to pivot. Right? Yeah. So exactly. you were pre-COVID pivoting in 2017 against the beast from the east, and you pick up some Sauvignon Blanc from Oxford, and this is your first hands-on experience with a hybrid, right? At that point.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, my experience previous to this has been in cold climates in areas where we, are creating Pinot Noir Chardonnay at a high-end boutique level. So, in terms of alternative varieties, the most alternative variety I have is probably Cab Franc at that point from South Africa.
Right.
Not as a consumer, but as a
producer,
as a winemaker.
Yeah.
Militurga is one of my favorite grapes for sure, but it's a very different thing to try to make something that you have no idea how it's going to be.
So that's interesting. So this is your first foray into hybrids. As you mentioned, you kind of like the way it reacted, it's more consistent. So was this your kind of epiphany that you could start to work with non-vitis vinifera, just straight up vitis vinifera, but hybrids, crossings, and then later PIWIs? Is this where the butterfly effect?
No, the butterfly moment happened years later, actually. And the thing is, with the Sauvignac, one thing I've learned about Sauvignac, and there's another producer who is really the godfather of Sauvignon Blanc, and as you know, is Peter Hall, right? Peter Hall and Breaky Bottom. And something that the idea behind the Sauvignac and that we made into a Col Fondo, it was really meant to be an early release wine. It also kickstarted the experimental range, which we now have at Blackbook, bringing these different varieties and sort of modifying, sort of trying different things and being a bit more innovative. But it took a very long time for this grape to come on board and to actually play ball. It's something that, again, what we're sort of looking at and how we're managing this sort of moving forward was, all right, we'll do this, we'll check it out, we'll see how it goes. And it was meant to be early release, but as it started aging more and more, we started to find out in actuality, it's much better with bottle age and sort of moving forward. And that was one sort of moment in this wine cycle where I sort of looked at it and really started to enjoy it. I enjoyed it as a base wine, but you really don't know. It's quite austere and weird for a while in bottle. The epiphany really came probably the following year in 2018. So the first year we had, we made effectively 4 wines and worked with 2 growers, and we had the supply and demand issue. The following year was 2018. And 2018 in the UK has really been known for its sort of brilliant Indian summer, amazing, brilliant, large yields. And, equates to, in theory, some brilliant fruit. So just to round out the brilliance of everything is, and that allowed us to go from, making 4 wines to making 8 or 9 wines and working with sort of 8 growers. Now, part of that journey, we brought in some really interesting and really interesting grapes, one of which was, 3 all came from one grower. So we brought in some Ortega, which we know really well in the UK as a sort of aromatic hybrid. We brought in some Bacchus, which is, again, something that we've been planting here for quite a while, and it's a Germanic hybrid and Austrian planted. And we've sort of hung our hats on, say, as the UK Sauvignon Blanc. And then the third one was a proper PIWI, which was, it's now called Cabaret Noir, but I still call it by its previous name, Cabernet Noir. And I think the Cabernet Noir, for me, was really the first indication that we can use PIWIs in a way to create familiar wines. I think that's a key point here, is to understand the commerciality of it. And that is based around, I think, consumers and consumerism bringing together these familiar aspects of whatever it is, whether it's name or flavor profile aromatics. And that was one that I sort of was like, I really like this. I can make this every year. Sadly,
Well, it depends, doesn't it? Because you've got, as you mentioned, those two areas. You've got the name, and then you've got the organoleptic, the sensory characteristics. Not all of them are named sexily. So,
yeah,
when you've got some like, especially like Divco, for example, which there are of course Alsatians along the Rhine that know about this chieftain that fought the Romans, but who else would know about it? And in the British speaking world, the English speaking world, it's like Divco. I don't know. It sounds like something, a company of not inspiring people. I don't know. So something along those lines. But of course, that for people might be a bit of a red flag. And there's Rondo, Regent, some of these old schooler hybrids.
Yeah, exactly.
But the sexy ones, like Sauvignac, which we'll talk about in a second, Cabaret, Cabernet Noir, and things like Souvignier Gris, they're the ones that have marketability, right?
100%. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at these in varying degrees. Cabernet Blanc, for instance, is another one. Cabernet Gris. Yeah, I mean, you could quite easily quickly pick something up and not read the label its entirety and go, oh, this is Sauvignon Blanc, and it's Sauvignac, or So there is these different aspects that sort of bring these things forward to allow us to then play. Not I want to say trick the consumer. It's not tricking the consumer. It's just bringing together familiarity and both name and flavor profiles. So the parentage of all these aforementioned are noble varieties, which is the basis of a lot of PIWIs, right? So it's giving that familiarity and that sort of understanding, and then educating the consumer a bit more around it.
So there's a couple of things there. So the educating I'll come to in a second. The first thing though, around those names. So of course we've now got a group, the German nurseries, the Swiss nurseries, the ones in Italy are being much more savvy when it comes to naming grape varieties. Do you foresee there being any issues with these names? Because as you mentioned, there could be some confusion with Cabaret, Cabernets, and Sauvignacs and Souvignier Gris, with the Gris part of it. Do you see there be any issues, maybe from certain countries? Because the reason why I bring this up is that there isn't much cohesion when it comes to vine breeders' nurseries around Europe. So of course you've got the French with the IRNA that are focusing on things like Voltis, that they've bred, and then you've got the likes of the Swiss and the Germans that have been breeding all these things like the Cabernet Cortis, etc. There doesn't seem to be the same page because they have their own agenda. Do you think there will be issues with countries adopting some of these PIWIs?
I don't think that's such a new thing. I think we've seen it with Hungary and Italy, right? We've seen with Tokai or and stuff like that, where how names can be changed and moved and be interpreted in different ways. I don't think it's necessarily from what I understand what you're saying to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is the registration and the awareness of what these are and how that translates to labeling wines. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, I think one thing in all these interviews I've been doing is that we're clearly seeing division across European member states with these varieties. But you're right. I think we don't. I mean, grapes have synonyms, don't they? And why can't we have synonyms in the future? And we're starting to see that with, you mentioned, with Cabernet Noir and Cabaret, and there's all these different names. So I'm guessing synonyms in the future. I mean, we have, how many does Tempranillo have in Spain? 30 different names?
And there's kind of now, and there's look, there's the I guess the way we label things and how things are interpreted can be debated for as long as we're alive. And that debate will continue on. And I think a lot of it has to do with people's interpretations of preservation around what they think is important to that culture and stealing that. Australians, for instance, taking port and Burgundy, and it's if none of these areas were particularly significant, no one would have batted an eye, right? It's just one of those things where I think you take these names because they're familiar and there's a marketing aspect to it, right? Like, and that's exactly what happened to Cabernet Noir. It's now Cabaret Noir on that basis. But I don't think, I think these names will continue to change, and whether or not you feel precious about it is a very different thing. I mean, I'm still going to label. I have a 2023 Cabaret Noir coming out that I will still label as Cabernet. I just think that it's going to forever be a debate where no one's going to win, and people are continuing to push boundaries. And if you're looking at registration, so INRA, for instance, if you're registering a varietal, it'll be registered one way, and then 10 years later, it'll be changed. The name will be changed a different way. And so
we put some questions out to students around this, and one of the questions we got was, what is the legality of this? So in England, you mentioned that you can label kind of these varieties as you want?
Yeah, I mean, look, the legality that stands around English wine and Welsh wine, it's actually in a bit of transition right now. We kind of seen, because we have Brexit and the moving away from EU regulation on the whole, has kind of seen DEFRA sort of lobbying different ways to change different things.
Yeah.
Amongst those, right, we have the legalization of selling piquettes, for instance. Another one, we've seen a Sussex PDO being created. Now, if you're looking at regulation within the PD or PGI and within the DEFRA regulations of wine standards, there isn't really any regulation around that if you're looking at varietal. I think when you get down to nitty gritty, if you look at the regulations that's surrounding sparkling wine, PDOs and PGIs, and things like Wine of England, which you can't put on, or sort of, what was it? I think it's Wine of England, which has to be a PGI or something to that effect. I do not do PGI or PDO, so it's all sort of through regular. Trying to remember this correctly, but that has a lot more regulation around the mass sulfur and the varieties that can be put within that wine itself. But if you're doing things like we are, so it's like a Vin de Pays or a Vin de Table, for instance, there's all that regulations kind of thrown out the window, and you can kind of put what you want in the wine and label it how you want, roughly.
And of course, you started your journey then, with this 28. I said started this part of your journey with 2018, bringing in Ortega, Bacchus, and then the Cabaret Noir as well. So you're shifting your focus a little bit with this bountiful crop of the 2018. I love the fact that you label with your PV, right? Because I know a lot of people in England initially, and I know it's changing now, but initially we just label them as like, their house reds or house whites, English reds. You've always made the decision to put the PV or the hybrid on the label. Yeah,
I mean, we there are two things that we do on the label. One is if it's a single varietal wine, which we don't always make, but if we do, we always have the variety on the label. The second thing we do is, as I said, everything's single vineyard. So the growers' names are always on the label as well. So those are two things that we haven't really sacrificed, and because we feel it's important to have clarity and transparency with what we do and how we do it.
And could we talk a little bit about Sauvignac, if possible? Because in all my interviews so far, I've had a lot of conversations around Souvignier Gris, Solaris, Muscaris, but I haven't had much of a conversation around Sauvignac. So would you talk a little bit about how you happened to sort of start working with the variety and why you did it and the benefits behind it?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a grower. His name's Duncan McNeil. He's based in Southern Essex. You would have I'm sure Jimmy, Duncan, and he's been managing some like 300-400 acres between Kent and Essex for the past 20 years or something about that. And he and I have always been chatting for, I'd say better half of 5 years about trying to do something together. Eventually, he had planted a 10.5, 11-acre site and it's in the Crouch Valley, and he planted a number of different Chardonnay clones, a number of different Pinot Noir clones, primarily Germanic. And then he also he's a stark advocate of sustainability like myself, and looking at the environmental impact, and also looking at what is, going to be, I guess, viable when Pinot Noir and Chardonnay have bad years. And so this thought process led to him planting a small amount of Sauvignac and a small amount of Pinotin.
Okay.
Both of which we work with. The latter, I'm not a huge fan of, but Sauvignac, I am. And the first vintage we worked with Sauvignac was the 2021 year, which was, I guess, if you look at all vintages to start with, 21 was probably not the most ideal. It was really wet and cold and miserable. And so we ended up getting we found out that year that vineyard had a huge frost pocket. And so we lost like 75% of the crop. And we ended up getting, maybe a few hundred kilos of Sauvignac, a few hundred kilos of Pinotin, a few hundred Pinots of Chardonnay, a few hundred Pinots of Pinot Noir. And for that year, we just sort of threw everything in. And what's interesting about Sauvignac that particular year is there's a first crop off the vineyard was the fact that I noticed two things of it. One is that there's virtually no disease on it. And two is also started to get this sort of reddish tinge, pink tinge. It's a white variety, as we know, or maybe we don't know. Sauvignac is a white variety, if you're unfamiliar with that. And through the development, it has varieties on it, so it's a little bit pink.